Once the victim of a wrongful arrest ordered by Judge Hollis Trevors himself, Jasmine Crockett returned, 10 years later, to the very courtroom that once humiliated her. But this time, she didn't come back with her head down. She came back leading a takedown that shook the system to its core. When the steel cuffs snapped around Trevor's wrists and construction tycoon Marcus Langley broke down in the interrogation room, the entire power structure collapsed. The only question is, how did Jasmine turn her past humiliation into the most powerful legal revenge the Texas courts have ever seen? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Houston, Texas. The courthouse was a furnace of tension. Police at the doors, press flooding the steps, and inside, every seat taken. On trial, Marcus Langley, a contractor accused of siphoning millions from school construction funds. But all eyes were on the woman leading the charge, Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't just here to argue law. She was here for justice. Real, personal justice. Because sitting on the bench, cloaked in black arrogance, was Judge Hollis Trevors, the man who once had her arrested for peacefully protesting police abuse a decade earlier. Back then, she was a law student with a cardboard sign. He'd signed her warrant with a smirk. Now she stood in heels, armed with subpoenas and scars. Trevors, known for crushing young lawyers, especially women, barely acknowledged her. But Jasmine didn't need recognition. She needed results, and she'd brought fire. Her last case nearly broke her. A child had died in foster care, and the system buried the evidence. Jasmine had typed her resignation. But the next day, a file landed on her desk. Langley's fraud, Trevors' signature. Coincidence? Number 8 calling. So now she was back in the courtroom that once humiliated her. And this time she wasn't alone. She had evidence, witnesses, and a storm that would tear his legacy apart. The courtroom doors had barely closed before Judge Hollis Trevors began tearing into her. Jasmine hadn't even finished placing her binder on the table when his voice boomed across the chamber, sharp and dripping with hostility. "Miss Crockett," he snapped, glaring at her like she just tracked mud onto the carpet. "I suggest you leave the performative nonsense at the courthouse steps." He didn't look up from his papers, just flipped a page slowly, then shook his head. "Because if you think this room is another stage for your justice crusade, you're about to be very disappointed." The defense attorneys chuckled under their breath. Trevors caught the reaction, then leaned back in his chair, hands folded like a man ready to deliver a lecture rather than preside over a trial. "Let's be clear from the start," he continued, now locking eyes with her. "This isn't Twitter. This isn't a TED Talk. This is a federal courtroom. And that outfit, that tone, and that attitude, you're already walking a fine line." He paused. "Frankly, I'm not sure if you're here to present evidence or to live stream your next dramatic moment to your followers." Jasmine stood still, her spine straight, her expression unreadable. But she felt the sting behind his words. She was wearing a gray tailored suit, nothing flashy. No jewelry except her watch. No makeup beyond the bare minimum. Still, it didn't matter. To him, her presence alone was an affront. He wasn't just challenging her professionalism. He was questioning her right to stand in that room at all. "You've built quite a reputation," Trevors said louder now, glancing toward the jury as if to make them co-conspirators in his disdain. "Activist turned attorney, social media darling. I've read about you, viral videos, sound bites, flashy cases full of righteous speeches. But let me tell you something, Miss Crockett. Real law isn't done in 30-second clips. Real law isn't about trending hashtags and public opinion. It's about rules, structure, discipline, and I don't give a damn how many followers you have. None of that holds weight here." He slammed her motion packet down on the bench. The sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. "This," he growled, "is not compelling. It's not even competent. It reads like you wrote it on the plane after watching too many courtroom dramas. Assumptions, accusations, conspiracy theories. Is this how you intend to argue a case involving over $300 million in taxpayer money? With vibes and volume?" The room was silent, except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the low hum of the air vents. Even the clerk had stopped typing. Jasmine could feel every eye on her. some with sympathy, others with suspicion, all of it pressing down like concrete. Travers stood from the bench, an unusual move for a judge during pretrial remarks. But this wasn't about decorum anymore. He wanted to dominate her physically, visually, and psychologically. "You want to know what I see when I look at you, Miss Crockett?" he barked. "I see someone who thinks being loud is the same as being right, who thinks throwing around big words and emotional appeals makes up for weak evidence and thinner logic. But this court is not your classroom, and I am not here to play your foil in some legal theater." Her assistant leaned in just enough to whisper, "He's baiting you. Don't bite, not yet." Trevor stepped down from the bench just 2 steps, but enough to stand almost at eye level with her across the courtroom. "You think you're the hero today," he said, voice tightening. "But let me make one thing absolutely clear. I will not let you hijack this courtroom with sensationalism. I will not tolerate posturing, and I will not be intimidated by some internet attorney with a chip on her shoulder." Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest, but her breathing stayed slow. She had trained for this, for him. Every insult, every backhanded comment, every stare designed to belittle and destabilize her, it was all calculated. Travers had done this before. He didn't fear evidence, he feared exposure. And he'd go to any length to discredit the one person in the room with the courage to put him on the record. The assistant's voice was barely audible now, but deadly serious. "He's not going to let you win, Jazz. Not unless you make it so loud, so clear, so undeniable, that even he can't suppress it. You have to make the walls shake." She nodded once slowly, almost imperceptibly, because she wasn't here to impress Judge Travers. She was here to take him down, brick by brick, word by word, truth by explosive truth. But what Judge Travers didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that Jasmine had come armed with more than paper. Long before she stepped into that courtroom, a ghost from his past had already handed her the key to shatter everything he was trying to protect. Jasmine's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the unbearable tension that had been building like a dam about to burst. She had endured everything Travers had thrown at her: the dismissals, the mockery, the outright sabotage of procedure. He had ruled out every exhibit, bank records, subpoenaed emails, sworn affidavits, as if facts were just distractions. He crushed every submission with the gavel of arrogance. The jury had watched silently as their judge turned his bench into a fortress of bias. And yet Jasmine remained composed, knowing something Travers didn't, that the truth he worked so hard to suppress had already been placed in her hands by someone who used to serve him. Just before entering the courtroom that morning, in the gray stillness of the staff garage 2 levels below, Jasmine had been approached by a woman in a long tan coat. She moved slowly, as if regret weighed more than her bones. "Ms. Crockett," she whispered, her voice barely a ripple in the silence. "I used to work for him." Jasmine turned. The woman glanced over her shoulder before continuing. "My name is Margot Ellis. I was his clerk for 6 years. I redacted documents, deleted files. I saw things no one else did. But last week, I found this." She handed over a small flash drive, weathered, scratched, like it had been hidden in the back of a drawer for years. "You didn't get it from me. If he knows I came to you—" She didn't finish. Jasmine nodded once, silently, took the drive, and slipped it into her case like a final bullet she prayed she wouldn't have to fire. Now back in the courtroom, with every legitimate submission denied and the clock ticking, Jasmine reached for that case. Travers had just finished berating her, again, for trying to submit another witness affidavit. "We are not running a courtroom based on paranoia and hearsay," he shouted. "I will not allow another page of speculation. If you don't have a sworn witness ready to testify, then sit down." She didn't sit. Instead, she calmly placed a compact speaker on the evidence table and took out the flash drive. Her hands moved slowly, not with hesitation, but with purpose, like a surgeon about to make the first incision. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cool but carrying enough weight to cut through the silence, "since every document I've submitted has been denied entry into this courtroom, I request the court's attention for something that cannot be redacted, suppressed, or overwritten." Travers leaned forward, suspicion already crawling across his face. "Miss Crockett, What exactly do you think you're doing? Jasmine didn't answer him. She pressed play. At first, the audio crackled faintly. Then the voice came through, grainy, unmistakable, and chilling. You make it disappear, understand? She's too ambitious for her own good. I don't want that affidavit on file. Lose it. Push the hearing. Just keep her spinning until it's too late. The voice of Judge Hollis Trevors echoed across the courtroom like thunder. The impact was immediate and devastating. The gallery erupted, reporters gasping, jurors looking around at one another, unsure if they'd just witnessed a mistake or a revelation. Even the defense team stiffened, eyes locked on Trevors. Langley's smug smirk vanished like smoke. The bailiff took an instinctive step forward but froze, unsure what to do. And then came the second line, more damning, more deliberate. Langley's taken care of his side. Now I'll handle mine. If she tries to bring in those bank records, I'll throw them out. Nobody questions this bench. Jasmine let the silence hang. Let the horror settle in. She turned toward the jury box slowly. That voice, she said quietly, belongs to the man presiding over this case. The one who told you he was impartial. The one who just struck down every single piece of evidence as irrelevant or unverified. You've just heard him admit, plainly on record, that he planned to do exactly that, before this trial even began. Judge Trevors shot up from his chair like a man lit on fire. His gavel struck the bench so violently it echoed like a gunshot, silencing every breath in the room. Enough, he roared, eyes burning with unfiltered rage. Miss Crockett, you are in contempt of this court. His voice cracked from the sheer force of it, spit flying from the corners of his mouth as he pointed at her like she was a criminal on trial. You have insulted the integrity of this bench, disrupted these proceedings, and introduced an illegally obtained fabrication into the record. He didn't pause for breath. This is no longer a hearing. This is a circus, and I will not be made a spectacle by some headline-chasing activist pretending to be a lawyer. He slammed the gavel again, hard enough to leave a dent in the wood. Bailiff, he barked, remove her from this courtroom immediately. She is barred from presenting further evidence. She is done here. The command reverberated through the courtroom like a siren, sending a wave of tension through the room. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Jurors stared in disbelief. The bailiff hesitated, 1 foot forward, then back, unsure whether to act or disobey. Trevors noticed the hesitation and grew louder, more unstable. That is a direct order. Get her out, now! His fury wasn't justice. It was desperation in a black robe. And everyone could see it. But Jasmine didn't back away. She didn't apologize. She didn't even blink. While Trevors roared from the bench like a man unraveling in real time, slamming his gavel, shouting about contempt, demanding her removal, she stood rooted to the courtroom floor, her voice still, unwavering, cold as iron. The recording you just heard, she said, projecting calm into a room trembling with chaos, was obtained legally. I have a signed wiretap authorization, issued by Judge Ramon Torres of the 126th District Court, filed 72 hours ago. The words hit the courtroom like a second detonation. The reporters froze mid-scribble. The jurors' heads snapped in her direction. Even the bailiff, halfway toward grabbing her, stopped in place like he'd been hit with a stun grenade. And Trevors, his mouth half open, hands gripping the bench like it might save him, went completely still. Jasmine reached into her briefcase, moving with the kind of deliberate control that only comes when you know the truth is finally about to eclipse power. She pulled out a white envelope, thick and sealed, stamped with the red judicial insignia of the state of Texas. This is the official wiretap order, she said, raising it into the light. Case number TX-2749C. It authorized the monitoring of 2 phone lines belonging to Mr. Marcus Langley and associated business numbers. Those lines were flagged by the state attorney's office as part of an ongoing investigation into contract fraud, bid manipulation, and public fund misappropriation. The room was silent, but the silence was loud. It had weight now. Even Langley had stopped smirking. His attorney leaned forward, eyes darting between Jasmine's hands and the judge's pale face. She walked the envelope to the clerk, each step crisp, echoing on the polished floor, like the slow countdown to something no one could stop. Your Honor, she continued, turning back toward the bench, not only was this wiretap granted legally, it was approved specifically to investigate the suppression of evidence relating to this case. That recording includes your voice, your orders, your admissions. Her eyes didn't leave his. It's not speculative. It's not circumstantial. It's you. Travers opened his mouth, but the words caught like gravel in his throat. He glanced to the side as if someone, anyone, might step in to help him reclaim control. But there was no rescue coming. Not this time. The clerk took the envelope, hands shaking as he opened it, eyes scanning the signatures. Jasmine continued, her voice now softer, but more lethal. You can threaten me. You can scream and pound your bench and accuse me of misconduct. But the truth has already left this room. That file has been submitted to the State Attorney General's office. Multiple copies are in the possession of 2 investigative journalists sitting in this very courtroom. And if you think I walked in here with only 1 bullet, you don't know me at all. Trevor's hands, once clenched in fury, now trembled ever so slightly on the bench. The bailiff still hadn't moved. The jury stared openly, some in disbelief, others in recognition. They were witnessing a collapse, not just of a man, but of a myth. The myth that those in power can bury the truth forever. And Jasmine, never raising her voice, never once pleading, had just driven a legal dagger straight through the heart of that illusion. The courtroom was paralyzed. Trevor's face, once flushed with arrogance and fury, now looked waxy under the overhead lights, as though every ounce of power had drained from him. But Jasmine wasn't done. She didn't just intend to reveal his corruption, she intended to make it undeniable. Her movements were deliberate as she reached back into her briefcase. This time she retrieved a heavy black binder, thick, zippered, stamped with an official state investigator's seal. She unzipped it slowly, letting the metallic teeth of the case sound louder than Trevor's cracking silence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, eyes locked on the front row. We have already heard the voice of this judge authorizing the burial of evidence. Now let's talk about why he wanted that evidence buried. She flipped open the binder and extracted a stack of papers held together by 2 brass fasteners. This is Plaintiff's Exhibit 24G, a complete record of wire transfers originating from Crestwood Holdings Lemonade, an offshore company with no physical office, no employees, and no identifiable product. And yet, over the span of 9 months, Crestwood moved more than $1.3 million into an account registered under the name H. Travers Consulting, LLC. She let the weight of the name sit. No such LLC exists in Texas or any other U.S. state. We search federal databases, state registries, and business license directories. It's a ghost, created for one purpose, to receive money in the dark. She walked to the clerk's table, laying down the stack as though she were presenting a body. The deposits are spaced methodically, each one following a major bid approval in the Langley School construction contracts by 10 to 14 days. The amounts aren't random, $110,000, then $150,000, then $125,000, each aligning with a project stage. If this were a coincidence, it would be the most mathematically suspicious coincidence in the history of public contracting. Her voice didn't rise. It tightened, like a wire being pulled between stone pillars. But there's more. She reached into the side pocket of the binder and pulled out a single page in a plastic sleeve. This is a bank statement from Echelon Private Bank in Zurich, Switzerland. This document, sourced through cooperation with the Swiss Financial Regulatory Authority and authenticated by the U.S. Financial Crimes Task Force, shows a $400,000 transfer from Crestwood Holdings to an account under the name Bryce K. Talbot. She turned to Travers and locked eyes. That's your brother-in-law, a man with no business in construction, no employment record in public service, and yet somehow he received nearly $500,000 1 week after a major school bond was approved. Gasps turned into whispers. The jury leaned forward. A reporter in the second row dropped her pen. Even Langley, who had been leaning smugly against the defense table minutes earlier, now sat with his hands pressed together, pale and still. And Travers? He didn't move. His hand hovered over his gavel, not out of authority, but because it was the only thing left to hold. Jasmine stepped back to the center of the courtroom like it was a stage she was born to stand on. not as a performer, but as a truth bringer. Her voice slowed, sharpened. This isn't about a technicality. It's not about one shady company or a crooked contractor. This is a blueprint, a pattern, a system, where judges like Hollis Trevors turn courtrooms into gatehouses for the powerful, where shell companies act as laundromats for dirty public money, and where silence is the currency of survival. She turned to the jury again, voice rising just enough to echo. This is no longer a case, she declared. This is a dismantling, a reckoning, a revelation that what we thought was justice has been nothing more than architecture designed to keep people like him in power. Today you've seen not just corruption, but complicity. You've seen the fingerprints, the money trail, the voice, and now the decision no longer belongs to Judge Trevors. It belongs to all of you. The courtroom didn't make a sound, not a cough, not a shuffle, only the soft humming of fluorescent lights overhead and the rapid click of a journalist's keyboard somewhere in the back. Trevors looked up, eyes hollow, lips pressed into a line. But the mask had fallen. The bench wasn't his shield anymore. It was his spotlight. Jasmine stood at the center of the courtroom, her binder now closed, the last page of damning evidence still echoing in the minds of everyone present. The air was dense, thick with the weight of what had just been exposed. Every juror sat frozen, each one processing the unimaginable. A sitting judge, the very symbol of justice, tied by paper, by wire, by money, to the very corruption he was meant to judge. She exhaled slowly, not to calm herself, but to signal that the next move was coming. Her voice was clear, measured, cutting through the tension like a blade through fog. Given the gravity of the evidence just submitted, she began scanning the room, not just addressing the judge, but the entire chamber. And in light of the legitimate questions surrounding judicial impartiality and procedural integrity, I respectfully move for a temporary suspension of these proceedings pending the outcome of a criminal ethics inquiry. She let the words settle. Trevor stiffened, his eyes wide, the veins on his neck pulsing beneath the collar of his robe. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. A bead of sweat formed above his brow. The gavel remained still in his hand, unmoved, because at this point it had become meaningless. Power only worked when people believed in it, and in that courtroom, belief had bled out of the walls like smoke through cracks in a broken facade. Jasmine looked toward the clerk, her tone unshaken. For the record, the request has already been submitted to the State Attorney General's office under Emergency Procedure TX-C-19. The supporting materials were filed last night, under seal. Then it happened. The rear doors of the courtroom swung open with slow, deliberate force, not loud but unmistakable, like the opening chords of an execution drum roll. Two figures entered, both in charcoal suits, no ties, expressionless. But it wasn't their presence that made the gallery shift in their seats. It was the glint of their badges, clipped to their belts. Texas Office of the State Prosecutor, Special Investigations Division. The room tilted. Eyes followed them as they advanced, not with aggression, but with purpose. A third agent followed close behind, carrying a heavy file box sealed with bright red evidence tape. The kind used when the state no longer asks for cooperation, but takes control. Trevor's face went blank. His lips twitched as if trying to form an objection, but the words were stuck, caught somewhere between instinct and dread. His hand reached for the gavel once more, but this time, it wasn't to strike. It was to anchor himself, to find some illusion of authority in a room that no longer obeyed his voice. The lead investigator stopped just 5 feet from the bench. He didn't yell. He didn't point. He simply opened a folder and addressed the judge as if reading off a tombstone. "Judge Hollis Trevors," he said, calm and formal, "you are named in an active investigation concerning obstruction of justice, abuse of judicial authority, and receiving illicit financial compensation through undisclosed third-party accounts. Under the authority of the Texas Attorney General's Emergency Intervention Statute, we are here to serve notice of administrative suspension and to escort you for immediate questioning." Silence detonated across the room. The jurors froze. Langley turned ghost white. The reporters in the gallery raised their phones like soldiers drawing weapons. Travers looked around, but no one stood for him. No one came to his defense, not even the bailiff. Jasmine remained at her table, composed, not triumphant, not emotional, just anchored in truth. She didn't need to say anything more. The system that had tried to crush her was now cracking under the weight of its own secrets. The courtroom had become a stage of reckoning, and Jasmine, without raising her voice, had pulled the curtain down. For a heartbeat, the room was utterly still, so still that even the soft whirring of a camera lens at the back of the courtroom sounded like thunder. Judge Travers, once towering in authority, now stood cornered behind his own bench, breathing hard, chest heaving, like a predator suddenly realizing the cage had closed from the outside. His eyes darted wildly, searching for something, someone to rescue him. But there was no ally left. The attorneys were silent. The clerk had stopped typing. The bailiff stared at the floor. Only Jasmine held his gaze, not with vengeance, not even with triumph, but with the silent force of truth made visible. "You can't," Trevor snarled, voice breaking under the weight of disbelief. "You can't do this. This is my courtroom, mine." His voice cracked again, more raw this time, less rage, more fear. He reached for the gavel with a trembling hand, as if the feel of it might restore his command, like a fallen king grasping a crown he could no longer wear. But it didn't make a sound. The investigator didn't even flinch. Calmly, methodically, he opened a leather pouch on his belt and pulled out a gleaming pair of stainless steel cuffs. "Sir," the agent said evenly, "you are being detained under suspicion of judicial misconduct, bribery, and obstruction of justice. We are acting under direct authority from the State Attorney General. You no longer have jurisdiction here. Step down from the bench." Travers didn't move. He shook his head, almost laughing. Bitter, dry, hollow. "This is a mistake," he stammered. "You're playing into her hands. She's a fraud. She doctored everything." His finger jabbed in Jasmine's direction, wild and accusatory. "She came in here to humiliate me. You're going to take her word over mine? You think the people want this chaos?" The gallery didn't answer. The jury didn't move. And Jasmine didn't even blink. Because in that moment, it was clear to everyone. The only chaos that existed had been carefully hidden beneath his robe for years. And now someone had dared to name it. "Turn around," the investigator repeated, voice lower now, sterner. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." But Travers didn't turn. He grabbed the edge of the bench, knuckles bone white, as if clinging to it might reverse the collapse. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice cracking like dry glass. "You hear me, Crockett? You'll regret this for the rest of your life. You think this is justice? You think this makes you a hero?" But even as he screamed, the agents moved in. One took his left arm, the other his right. He struggled, not violently, but like a man unraveling, shouting empty threats into the silence of a courtroom that no longer feared him. And then came the click. The metal cuffs closed over his wrists with a crisp finality that sounded louder than any verdict ever spoken. Flashes erupted from the gallery, camera shutters firing like gunshots, capturing the moment from every angle. The once untouchable judge, now cuffed, robe wrinkled, hands behind his back. Reporters scrambled to file alerts. One whispered, "This is going live in 20 seconds." Trevor's shoulders sagged as he was led away, each step heavier than the last. His face, red and trembling, turned toward Jasmine one final time. Eyes bloodshot, mouth twitching, but utterly defeated. Whatever power he once held had vanished into ink, audio, and truth. As he crossed the threshold toward the exit, a voice broke the silence. Not loud, not theatrical, but rich with quiet history. It came from the back row, where an elderly black man, dressed in a faded gray suit and worn leather shoes, leaned slightly forward in his seat. His eyes never left Trevor's. His voice, though low, carried. "Finally," he said almost reverently, "someone stood up." The words echoed in the silence like a blessing. Jasmine heard them. So did the jury, so did the press. And in that fragile, historic moment, amid the collapse of a judge's kingdom and the cold steel of consequence, those words didn't just describe what had happened. They defined it. The courtroom was nearly empty now, but the weight of what had just happened still hung in the air like a storm that hadn't passed, only shifted direction. Judge Travers was gone, hauled off in handcuffs, his last words echoing like the empty threat of a man watching the world he built crumble brick by brick. But one person remained behind, anchored to his seat by something heavier than steel. Marcus Langley, the once untouchable construction mogul, the man who laughed openly at Jasmine's filings, who whispered jokes to his defense team like the whole thing was a show, was now visibly shaking. His hands, manicured and tan, clutched the edge of the table. His gaze darted around the courtroom as if looking for a back door that no longer existed. Jasmine didn't approach him immediately. She let the silence grow. Let the sound of folding chairs and murmuring reporters fade out behind the heavy courtroom doors. And when she finally did walk toward him, it was slow, measured, like a surgeon approaching an open wound she already knew the shape of. Langley looked up at her, sweat forming just beneath his eyes. "You got what you wanted," he muttered. "Travers is gone. That was your target, right? That's it, isn't it?" But Jasmine didn't nod. She didn't soften. She leaned in just slightly, voice cold and unblinking. "Marcus, if you think this ends with a single fall guy in a black robe, you really haven't been paying attention." He blinked, startled by the iciness in her tone. She continued, "You've got two choices. Option one, we get in the car, drive straight to your downtown office, open your safe, and turn over every document, transaction, and off-the-book contract in that building. Option two, you sit right here, say nothing, and tomorrow the FBI kicks in your front door before sunrise with a federal search warrant and a live broadcast crew." She leaned even closer, her words slow and deliberate. "And you already know which one makes your wife's name show up in the papers." Langley's breath caught. For a moment he looked like a child who just realized the monsters in the dark were real and had his address. "You don't understand," he finally whispered. "It's not just me. I don't move that kind of money unless someone bigger clears it. I just execute. I take the approved bids and make them look clean." Jasmine's expression didn't change. "Then give me the one signing off on the dirt." She motioned to the bailiff, who opened a side door leading to a private interview chamber, soundproof, sealed, with a recorder already rolling. Langley followed reluctantly like a man walking into confession with no chance at redemption. Inside, the room was clinical and cold. A single light overhead, a steel table, two chairs, and a mirrored window that hid federal observers behind the glass. Jasmine didn't sit. She stood. Langley sat, hunched forward, his elbows on the table like he was holding his head in place. "I'll talk," he said, "but I want full immunity." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "You'll get protection. Immunity depends on how useful you are." He nodded. Then after a long breath, he reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a business card, creased at the edges, and placed it on the table. "This is the man. He's the one behind all of it. The contracts, the bid rigging, the backdoor donations. Travers was just the cover. He pulls the strings." Jasmine flipped the card over and saw a name written in careful penmanship. Robert J. Peterson, state senator, public reform advocate, champion of clean government bills, and the man who, 5 years ago, had gone on national television to call her a dangerous radical pretending to be a lawyer. Jasmine stared at the name, her fingers tightening on the paper. "Peterson's untouchable," Langley added, voice low. "He's got leverage on 3 city mayors and half the union leaders in Southeast Texas. You want to bring him down? You'll need more than just this." Jasmine looked him in the eye, fire beneath the surface of her composure. "Then you'd better open the damn safe." Outside the interview room, Jasmine's assistant was already on the phone with the Attorney General's office. She stepped to the door and gave a single command. "Tell them Langley flipped, and tell them the next name is a sitting state legislator. We need a new warrant, and we need it tonight." Behind her, Langley crumbled forward in his chair, as if the confession had emptied the last of his strength. But Jasmine, she stood taller. Her enemy was no longer a judge. Now it was the man sitting in the Capitol dome, and he had no idea she was coming. The air inside the surveillance van was thick with anticipation, wires humming and screens flickering, as the tactical team prepped their comms. Jasmine stood in the center, her arms crossed, eyes locked on the thermal feed of the warehouse 2 blocks away. Every breath she took was controlled, every muscle coiled like a live wire. She was no longer the outsider battling in someone else's courtroom. Tonight, she was the one setting the trap. Beside her, Commander Hayes of the Texas SWAT Task Force tapped his earpiece and gave her a nod. "He's here. SUV just rolled in. That's Peterson." Jasmine didn't speak. She already knew. The grainy footage showed the silhouette of a tall man stepping out of the back seat, clutching a black leather briefcase like it held a nation's secrets. And in a way, it did. The location was no accident. A condemned distribution warehouse on the city's edge, long forgotten by zoning officials and conveniently absent from the latest tax records. It was the perfect meeting point. Quiet, remote, shielded by empty lots and a steel fence rusted with silence. Peterson wasn't just coming to chat. According to Langley's confession, this was the final pass-off, the moment when the state senator would hand a sealed folder of fraudulent infrastructure contracts to a known offshore fixer. Jasmine had cross-referenced the man's name through Interpol and matched 3 shell companies to the same address in the Caymans. Tonight's meeting would finalize the laundering of over $45 million in misappropriated public funds, unless they stopped it cold. "2 more going in," Hayes muttered, watching the feed. "Bodyguards, armed." Jasmine leaned in toward the radio mic. "Confirm you've got eyes on the bag?" The sniper positioned on a rooftop 2 buildings away answered instantly. "Affirmative. It hasn't left Peterson's hand. Brown leather, steel clasp, looks heavy." Jasmine's mind raced. That bag wasn't just a prop. It contained duplicates of every fake contract Langley mentioned. False estimates, overpriced bids, signature pages preloaded with forged names. Enough to indict half the political donors in the state. If Peterson got away, those documents would vanish into the wind, and with them, justice. Hayes gave the go. "Team 1, you're green in 30 seconds. Breach pattern C. We take him alive." The SWAT team confirmed, already moving into position. 2 from the south alley, 1 through the loading dock, and 2 covering the east wall near the power junction. Jasmine grabbed her vest from the seat and zipped it tight. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice flat but electric. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You're not law enforcement." "I'm the reason we're here," she snapped. "That man tried to destroy my life, and everyone who trusted this government to protect them. I need to see how it ends." Hayes nodded once. No argument. Outside, the moon hovered low and sharp over the skyline, casting everything in silver tension. Jasmine followed behind the second SWAT wave as they crept up the loading ramp, her pulse a steady war drum in her chest. Inside the warehouse, voices echoed faintly. Peterson was speaking. Through the thermal camera feed, she saw him pacing, gesturing with the case, talking to a man in a gray suit with a tablet. "That's the broker," Hayes whispered into comms. "Money's transferring now." Then, "Execute." The breach was a controlled thunderstorm. Flashbangs detonated in synchronized bursts, shattering the quiet with light and sound. "Go, go, go!" The team surged through the doors, one from the side, one from the floor, rappelling down from the catwalk like shadows with rifles. Chaos erupted. The fixer dropped the tablet and ran for the back exit. Peterson froze for half a second, then bolted in the opposite direction, the briefcase still clutched tight in his hand. "Senator Peterson, stop! Hands in the air!" One officer yelled, chasing after him. Jasmine burst into the space moments later, ducking past a splintered pallet. She spotted him weaving through broken shelving, knocking over boxes in a mad dash toward the garage exit. "He's heading east!" she shouted. "Cut him off!" Peterson was panting, desperate, eyes wild as he hit the rolling door and shoved it open an inch before a SWAT agent tackled him to the ground. The case skidded across the concrete and slammed into a metal crate. "Clear! We've got him!" came the shout over comms. Jasmine ran up just as they lifted Peterson to his feet. His tie was askew, his face twisted in disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom the moment had actually arrived. "You're making a mistake," he spat. "I'm a state official. This is a political attack." Jasmine stepped forward slowly. "Then I assume you'll have no problem explaining what's in that briefcase. or why your fixer was live routing funds through a Cayman shell tied to 3 federal indictments. The officer opened the case with a gloved hand. Inside, stacks of sealed folders, each marked with forged bid labels, engineering diagrams with falsified signatures, and one flash drive wrapped in a rubber band. "That's everything," Jasmine whispered. "That's the whole operation." Peterson's shoulders sagged as if someone had cut his strings. "You'll never make it stick," he said weakly. "You think the voters care? They'll forget in a week." Jasmine didn't blink. "We're not here for voters," she said. "We're here for the truth." As the agents read Peterson his rights and led him to a waiting armored van, Jasmine stood still, surrounded by empty crates and shattered silence. She looked up at the cracked skylight above her, the stars barely visible through the grime. A gust of wind blew through the warehouse, lifting one loose contract page from the floor and carrying it toward the door. Like the ghosts of all the schools, roads, and bridges that were never built because men like Peterson got paid to make them disappear. And for the first time in years, Jasmine didn't feel like she was chasing justice. She felt like she had finally caught it. The trial of the century didn't take place in Washington, D.C. or a federal courthouse gilded with marble. It unfolded quietly, yet thunderously, in Houston, Texas, under the full weight of truth finally given its moment. The courtroom was standing room only, filled not with elites or distant press, but ordinary citizens who had followed Jasmine Crockett's journey like a war they refused to ignore. And this time, there was no shouting judge, no suppressed evidence, no mocking laughter from behind polished defense tables. There was order. There was truth. And there were 3 men who once ruled cities from the shadows, now seated in the defendant's box, chained together by facts they could no longer outrun. Langley looked hollowed out, the once cocky mogul reduced to a gray suit 2 sizes too large. Travers refused to meet anyone's eyes, his robe replaced with a jumpsuit that stripped away every illusion of dignity he clung to. Peterson, always the politician, still tried to flash smiles, shake hands, manipulate the gallery with glances. But no one looked back. No one bought it anymore. Not after the contracts, not after the offshore accounts, not after the warehouse raid where he was caught running with a briefcase full of lies. The prosecution laid out the case in brutal, beautiful order. Jasmine didn't need to speak every day. Her work spoke for itself. The paper trail, the recordings, the ledger, the map of betrayal etched across 10 years of deals, dinners, and destruction. When the final verdicts were read, guilty on all counts, the silence wasn't celebratory. It was reverent, as if justice had finally drawn breath in a room that had been suffocating for decades. Langley, 18 years for conspiracy and wire fraud. Travers, 25 years for judicial corruption and obstruction of justice. Peterson, 30 years without parole for orchestrating a criminal enterprise that spanned from city halls to corporate boardrooms. Jasmine stood in the back of the courtroom, arms folded, not in victory, but in vigilance. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Her presence alone was louder than any cheer could ever be. Outside, the media waited, not with microphones, but with reverence. Her name was no longer just attached to the case. It had become a movement. Crockett Doctrine, they called it. A new model for accountability. A roadmap for pushing back against systems designed to silence truth. But what surprised Jasmine most wasn't the headlines. It was what came after. The letters, the messages, the envelopes that began arriving at her office, one after another, by the dozens, then the hundreds, then the thousands. Not from donors, not from politicians, from people, the forgotten, the trampled, the invisible. One came from a retired Army colonel in Georgia. His handwriting was shaky, but his words sharp. "I've served in 2 wars," he wrote, "but the battle you fought in that courtroom showed more courage than I ever did under fire. Thank you for reminding this country what integrity looks like." Another came from a woman in Iowa, 87 years old, who had once lost her house to an eminent domain scheme Peterson had silently greenlit. "They said the city needed my land for a school. There's still no school there, just a parking lot and silence. Thank you for making the silence speak." One came from a man who had spent 19 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. His letter was just 3 sentences. They told me the law doesn't care. Watching you made me believe it could. Jasmine read every single one. Some days she wept quietly at her desk, alone. Other days she read them aloud to her team. They built a wall in the office, not with awards or headlines, but with the letters. Handwritten, typed, mailed with no return address, covered in stamps and stickers, and sometimes still smelling of smoke or lavender or tears. They called it the Wall of the Silenced. And every time she passed it, she remembered why she'd sworn, 10 years ago in a jail cell, with cold steel tight around her wrists, that she'd never let anyone else be erased the way she almost had been. And still, the work didn't stop. After the trial, Jasmine was offered TV deals, book contracts, even Senate endorsements. She declined most of them. "This isn't a brand," she said once to a reporter. "This is a reckoning." Instead, she started something no one expected, a legal task force dedicated to reinvestigating old corruption cases, especially ones dismissed by compromised judges, like Trevor's. She called it the Unfinished Project, and within 6 months, her team had reopened 31 cases. 12 convictions were overturned. 2 wrongfully imprisoned men walked free into the arms of families who hadn't touched them in decades. The nation watched in awe and fear, because for every person who called her a hero, there were others whispering she was dangerous, that she was burning down the system, that she was going too far. But Jasmine knew the truth. The system had already been burned. She was just refusing to let the smoke be swept under the rug. One night, long after midnight, she sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by stacks of new letters, when a package arrived. No name, no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed Jasmine in court, standing alone, binder in hand, staring down Judge Trevor's. On the back, scrawled in pencil, was one line: "This is what courage looks like." She sat with the photo in her lap for a long time. Then quietly she stood up and pinned it to the Wall of the Silenced. Not as a trophy, as a reminder. Because courage didn't come from victory. It came from walking into a room where you weren't wanted, where every rule was written to break you, and standing anyway. It came from being mocked, ignored, threatened, and speaking anyway. It came from being told over and over again, "You don't belong here," and answering back, "Watch me." Justice didn't sleep anymore. Not because Jasmine Crockett had shouted louder, but because she had refused to stay quiet. The day had finally come when the relentless pursuit of truth became more than a battle. It became a beacon of hope for every soul betrayed by a system built on silenced voices and broken promises. In a grand new courtroom, filled with the weight of history and the resolve of a nation weary of injustice, Jasmine Crockett stood before a sea of faces that spanned generations. Her eyes, clear and unyielding, scanned the crowd, a mosaic of older men who'd seen decades of promises crumble, women who'd been dismissed and devalued, and those who had once been left to wander in the margins of society. For them, every cold decision, every manipulated verdict, and every covert bribe had left scars that whispered of a time when truth was suppressed and justice was a far-off dream. But here, in this moment, Jasmine's presence radiated with the power of steadfast integrity, a quiet force that defied the roar of corruption. "Truth doesn't need to shout," she declared, her voice resonating like a rallying cry through the hushed hall. "It only needs to stand firm, unyielding, and unafraid." Her words were not merely a statement, they were an embodiment of a journey fought with every ounce of perseverance and an unbreakable will forged in the crucible of hardship. For years she had been the target of injustice, repeatedly cast aside by those who thought power could silence determination. And yet she had risen from every fall, transforming every moment of despair into a testament of resilience and hope. In that courtroom, where the echoes of past oppressions met the promise of a new dawn, Jasmine's voice united those who had long been ignored, a clarion call for a future defined not by what was taken, but by what could be reclaimed. As the final verdicts echoed through the chamber, sentences for Langley, Travers, and Peterson that marked the end of an era of unchecked corruption, a palpable silence settled over the room, heavy with the realization that true justice had finally been served. Outside the courthouse, the streets buzzed with a renewed energy as the news broke. A system once cloaked in deceit had been dismantled piece by piece by the unwavering determination of a single woman. For every older veteran who had fought battles on distant battlefields, for every elderly person who had suffered from promises unfulfilled, and for every individual wrongfully condemned by a system that thrived on neglect, Jasmine's victory was a vindication, a signal that the long-forgotten could rise again. Letters began to flood her modest office, each envelope a personal chronicle of hardship and hope. A retired Marine from Virginia, his voice weathered by years of service and sacrifice, wrote, "I've seen wars fought and promises broken, but watching you stand in that courtroom has rekindled a fire in me, a belief that the system can change if we dare to challenge it." An elderly woman from a small Midwestern town, whose life had been upended by corporate greed and governmental neglect, penned tear-stained lines proclaiming, "You've given us a reason to believe in justice again, to dare to hope that every wrong can be righted." Even those who had spent long, lonely years behind bars, wrongfully convicted and forgotten, sent their silent, heartfelt thanks, declaring that Jasmine's courage had restored a measure of dignity and faith in the law. These letters, each a testament to lives upended by injustice, became the very fabric of a movement built not on the clamor of protest, but on the quiet, relentless power of truth standing firm. In the days that followed the trial, Jasmine found herself at the center of a phenomenon that no one could have predicted. The media heralded her not as a controversial figure or a renegade lawyer, but as a champion for the downtrodden, a beacon for those who had lost faith in institutions that were meant to protect them. Across television screens and online platforms, her message echoed, "Justice isn't won by the loudest voice. It's won by the steadfast spirit that refuses to be silenced." In community centers, veterans groups, and senior citizen homes, groups gathered to listen to her speeches, where every word was measured, every pause deliberate, and every sentence a spark of inspiration. She recounted her journey, not as a tale of personal triumph over adversity alone, but as a call to action for all who had been marginalized by a system built on apathy. "We are not defined by the injustices we've suffered," she would say, her gaze intense and compassionate, "but by our resolve to transform those injustices into a future where every individual is seen, heard, and valued." Her words resonated deeply with those who had felt invisible for far too long. They saw in her not just a lawyer or an activist, but a mirror reflecting their own struggles and hopes, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth could be kindled by a single, determined soul. Jasmine's transformation from a woman who had once been shackled by injustice to a national symbol of resilience was as unexpected as it was profound. The letters continued to pour in, each one a small victory against the decades of silence imposed by corrupt institutions. A man who had been forced to live on the fringes after a wrongful conviction wrote, "For years, I believed justice was a myth, a story for those who never faced the real world. But you, Jasmine, have made it tangible. You've given us a reason to believe that even when all seems lost, the truth can rise like a phoenix." Another letter, this one from a middle-aged factory worker who had lost everything due to systemic negligence, read, "I spent my life working with calloused hands, believing that honesty was a luxury. But your courage has shown me that true strength is not in the power of money, but in the power of integrity." Every letter, every email, every whispered thank you that reached her was a reminder that her fight was not just about winning a case. It was about healing a broken system and mending the lives it had shattered. In her modest office framed by a wall of letters and photographs, Jasmine could see the faces of those who had trusted in her, who had waited for justice in a world that had long forgotten what it meant to be fair. With every story she read, the layers of societal neglect and systemic corruption peeled away to reveal the raw humanity beneath. There were letters from ex-convicts, many of whom had spent years in prisons that were less about rehabilitation and more about punishing those who dared to question the status quo. One such letter, penned in spidery handwriting, and signed only with the initials MR, detailed years of indignity, long nights of remorse, and a burning desire to see a system that once condemned him to face its own reckoning. In another envelope, an elderly woman recounted how she had lost her home to eminent domain, her properties sacrificed on the altar of bureaucratic expediency, and yet she found solace in the knowledge that Jasmine's victory meant a step towards a system that would finally respect the vulnerable. These narratives coalesced into a symphony of resilience, a reminder that justice, when pursued relentlessly, could be the most powerful force of change. Yet the path forward was not without its own shadows. As the trial concluded, critics emerged, arguing that Jasmine's methods were too unorthodox, that her crusade was as much about spectacle as it was about truth. But for every detractor, there were thousands who saw her as the personification of hope, a woman who had taken on an entrenched establishment and emerged victorious without compromising her values. The days following the verdict saw mass rallies in city squares across the nation. Veterans in uniform marched side by side with activists and ordinary citizens, their banners reading, "Truth stands tall," and "Justice is not a spectator sport." At town hall meetings, over cups of coffee in small diners, people discussed how Jasmine's battle had rekindled a forgotten faith in the rule of law. Community leaders, some of whom had been previously ignored by politicians, found their voices amplified. They too began to challenge a system that had long placed profit and power above human dignity. On one particularly crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps, Jasmine stood on a makeshift stage at a public rally. The air was cool and filled with an almost palpable sense of anticipation. Hundreds of people gathered, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of street lamps and the fervor of shared purpose. Jasmine took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice carrying both the scars of past battles and the promise of a future reborn in the light of truth. "We have learned," she said, her tone steady and unwavering, "that justice does not belong to those who hold power. It belongs to every person who has ever been dismissed, every soul that has been crushed by the weight of indifference. The truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to stand, firm and resolute." Her words washed over the crowd like a tide of reassurance. Today, we stand together, not as victims of a broken system, but as warriors armed with the truth, the courage, and the unyielding will to change our world. The crowd erupted in cheers, voices mingling with the cool night air, as if the very stars above were listening in solidarity. In that moment, Jasmine was more than a lawyer. She was the embodiment of every person who had ever been betrayed by the promise of justice. A living testament to the fact that even when the system is rigged against you, the power of perseverance and the strength of a steadfast heart can create ripples that transform the entire landscape. Her message was clear and uncompromising. The true measure of justice is not in the authority wielded by those in power, but in the courage of those who dare to challenge that power. "Our fight is not over," she continued, eyes sweeping over the sea of faces that reflected pain, hope, and determination. "But tonight we have sent a message that no matter how many times the corrupt try to bury the truth, it will always find a way to rise, unbowed and unbroken." And as the applause rose, echoing off the brick walls of that humble courthouse, it was clear that a new chapter had begun, one where justice, forged in the fires of relentless struggle, would never sleep again. The legacy of that trial and the subsequent triumph was not measured in headlines alone, but in the lives transformed by its ripple effects. In the months that followed, communities across the nation began to demand accountability. Legislation was proposed to overhaul outdated systems, to protect the rights of the marginalized, and to ensure that those who once wielded unchecked power would be held to the highest standards of transparency and accountability. Jasmine's name became synonymous with a revolution that wasn't violent, but was as unstoppable as time itself. It was a revolution built on the quiet strength of those who refused to be forgotten, on the courage of a single woman who had turned her personal struggle into a call for national redemption. For every veteran who read her words and found solace in the fact that someone was finally fighting for their dignity, for every elderly person who discovered that their pain was acknowledged, and for every wrongfully convicted individual who saw in her the promise of a fairer system. Jasmine's journey was a beacon, a lighthouse in a stormy sea of injustice, and in the hearts of those who once believed that the scales of justice were forever tipped against them, a quiet revolution was brewing, a revolution that started with one unyielding truth, that power may be wielded by many, but only the brave have the strength to stand against it. As the years marched on, and the movement Jasmine ignited continued to gain momentum, the lessons of that fateful trial were etched deeply into the national consciousness. It was said that on a chilly evening in Houston, under a sky filled with countless stars, a woman once labeled a radical stood tall in a courtroom, defying every injustice thrown her way, not with brute force, but with a steadfast commitment to truth. And as her voice echoed through every corner of the nation, from the quietest back rooms to the grandest halls of government, she reminded us all that justice is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is a right that belongs to every human being who dares to dream of a better, fairer world. In the end, Jasmine Crockett's victory was not measured by the downfall of a corrupt regime alone, but by the hearts and minds she transformed along the way. The letters, the testimonies, the quiet nods of gratitude from those once cast aside, they all served as a testament to the fact that when truth is allowed to stand, even against the greatest odds, it changes everything. And as the nation looked to the horizon, they saw not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a new era. One where justice, fueled by courage, persistence, and an unwavering belief in the sanctity of truth, would never again be forced into silence. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.